Okay, Assalamu alaikum, and a very warm welcome to everybody. Thank you guys very much for sparing your time to be with us today. I'm Alia. Hi, I'm your MC for today. So, first things first, some thank yous. Thank you to Muka Cafe for allowing us to have such a wonderful space for this event, and to Piecemeal for organizing this today. Oh, yeah. For those of you who don't know, Piecemeal consists of a group of youth who aim to promote a cultural, spiritual, and intellectual understanding of Islam through interactive programs in neutral spaces with other youth. They're based in the Klang Valley, and they discuss various issues with the hope of getting closer to the Creator. Tonight, everybody, we have come together to discuss, to learn more on how the Malay archipelago, also known as Nusantara, functioned kind of like Amazon. And by that, we don't mean the jungle in South America, but rather the online retail space that buys and sells several goods and even makes its own. Muhyiddin will show us the extent of the Nusantara network and its impact. Now, to give the speaker his due, a little introduction about Muhyiddin, if you guys aren't regulars here and don't know about him. Muhyiddin bin Hussein Al-Attas is currently completing his MPhil at the Center of Advanced Studies on Islam, Science and Civilization, better known as CASIS, at University Technology Malaysia. And he used to lecture at KUIS, yes, and is now at Adni Pre-University, where he teaches, what does he teach? Where he teaches the worldview of Islam and the map of knowledge. Very interesting stuff. Right now, his research interest is inside Muhammad Naqib Al-Attas's conception of the West, encompassing the origins of the worldview of the West, its philosophical, cultural, and religious roots, and how this worldview is impacting the world at present. If you guys have any questions, you can write it down, or later on we'll pass the mic around and you can question the speaker himself. So without further ado, let me pass the floor to Muhyiddin.
Thank you, Alia. And a warm welcome to everyone for tonight's event. Let us begin, because when we talk about the network of scholars, the network of awliya or saints of this part of the world, we mean people of flesh and blood. We mean people of the prophetic sunnah. So let us mention some of their names and give a Fatiha to them in the hopes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewards them for what they have done for us. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cause some of their secrets, some of their knowledge, and some of their akhlaq to descend upon us so that we may relay some of the things that they have done. Al-Fatiha ila hadrati Sayyidina wa Habibina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah wa ila ruhil ulama al-amilin wa sufiyatil muhaqqiqin wa ahla dhikri wa tauhid wa masyaikh hadhihi al-ummah wa khususan ila ruhi Sayyidina Ahmad al-Kushashi wa Ibrahim al-Qurani ila ruhi Sayyidina Murtada al-Zabidi, Imam al-Ghazali, Muhyiddin ibn Arabi wa Sayyidina Imam al-Nawawi, Imam Ahmad bin Idris al-Shafi'i wa ila ruhi jami'i sadatina Ali Abi Alawi, ila ruhi Sayyidina Ahmad bin Isa al-Muhajir, ila ruhi Sayyidina Syekh Abu Bakar bin Salim, Abdullah bin Abu Bakar Aidrus, Abu Bakar bin Abdullah Al-Adani, wa ila ruhi Sayyidina Syekh Hamzah Fansuri, Nuruddin Ar-Raniri, Syamsuddin Sumatrani, Yusuf Makassari, Daud bin Abdullah Al-Fatani, Ahmad Al-Fatani, Muhammad Nafis Al-Banjari, wa Arshad Al-Banjari, wa usulihim wa furu'ihim, wa Daud wa Abdus Samad Al-Falimbani, wa usulihim wa furu'ihim, wa dhabil huquqi alaihim ajma'in, anna Allah yaghfir lahum wa yarhamhum wa yu'li darajatihim fil jannah, وينفعنا بأسرارهم وأنوارهم وعلومهم ونفحاتهم في الدين والدنيا والآخرة. الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا. ربنا زدنا علما نافعا وارزقنا فهما. ربنا أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. آمين. Anyways, tonight it's not only our discussion pertaining to the networks. But I'd also like to recap with what we have done this year, since this is going to be the fourth installment. It's a quarterly talk that we do every 3 months. So the first talk which we discussed was on cooking and looking at history, basically where I introduced the concept of how history, as a subject which is value laden, somehow is influenced by not only the methods that you choose to arrive at your historical conception and historical conclusions, but also the idea that the very people who write the history, what you highlight, what you prioritize in the history, will determine your position. Sorry, I had a 3-hour class today, so my brain's shouting, "Qahwa ya Sheikh, qahwa ya Sheikh." That means to say, coffee, my lord. Anyways, so after distilling this this idea, then we find out that actually historians of Southeast Asia come from, I suppose, many parts. Predominantly, a lot of them were European historians, composing of ethnologists and so on. And these people became the very source of the later day historians when they want to cite, because they were also meticulous in their recording of data of history. However, as some of you now who are regulars here and who have gone on to study with Professor Tatiana and our other teachers at CASIS, and those who have read, actually there are local sources of history also. Yes, the likes of Raja Ali Haji. Local historiography is not without interesting data that you can they can derive from. But the other more important sources of history includes also the tradition of scholarship that started here. Yes, because the tradition of scholarship in this part of the world is not like its Western or Greek counterpart. You see, the Western Greek intellectual tradition progresses through parricide. Yes, meaning to say the killing of your teachers, the killing of your masters. They suffer a perpetual Oedipal complex in their education or in their intellectual tradition, such as a great thinker becomes great by virtue of the fact that he has somehow refuted his teacher, or that somehow he has read some of the greats and claimed to have not read them. That's a very famous case happened, I think, in the 20th century. I shall not name drop, but the man who claimed to have not read Nietzsche was a very prominent psychologist whose very insights rely a lot on what Nietzsche already wrote, which was widely published. Anyways, so I said that since our intellectual tradition does not progress by parricide, but rather every new addition adds into the size and the stature of the ancestor becomes all the more greater. As a result, it becomes a very important source of history also. Yes, and what a great source of history it will be, because right now the history shall highlight scholars in our tradition. Yes, men of knowledge, men of learning. And men of learning and discernment, since they were Muslims also, they were also people of great moral integrity. So this picture of history that derives not just from our historical works, because history is somehow connected with power structures. Yes, because the historians like Raja Ali Haji and others, they were concerned with writing about the origins of the kingdoms. They were concerned about writing down trade and how to consolidate power and marriages of princes and princesses and so on. Whereas other local, maybe not just Malay sources, but Javanese sources will recount, for example, the triumph of the Majapahit or the triumph of the Srivijaya, the marriages of princes. The scholarly tradition, on the other hand, will write such and such is a student of such and such, and so and so was the one who first translated a said work. The so and so was the one who commented on a certain work. So silsila is a great part of the Malay history. Yes, And that is why our history in Bahasa Melayu is called sejarah. Yes, sejarah from the Arabic word shajarah. Yes, and shajarah means to say like a tree. And that famous metaphor is meant to reflect that whatever branches that we see today, or rather whatever fruits that come from the history that we see today, is in fact the result of the seed. Yes, the great acorn, or the great tree, the great oak tree that we see today is the result of what was once in the acorn. So, all the more interesting about the Malay world is because the initial propagators of Islam to this part of the world were connected also to the household of the prophets. These were the direct descendants of the prophet who not only privileged their silsilah through the being connected through knowledge, but also they were connected to the masters of sciences of learning from the silsilah of their ancestry, through their family tree. So a scholar is born to the house of a scholar, who's born to a house of the scholar, and so on and so forth. So like this, we now have liberated the potentialities of our history to highlight a different happening. Just imagine, for example, if in today's terms, if a group of, say, bricklayers possessed, say, a printing press. Yes, they have a newspaper of their own. Every day, the newspaper will print news in terms of reference and in terms of relevance to the bricklayers. So you'll have story about where bricks come from, what are the achievements of the best bricklayers of your time, what are the taxes pertaining to bricklaying, and so on and so forth. So if you have these records based on scholars, then you will have precisely what are most important historical aspects of basically scholarship. And this is why the Malay world is so privileged. Yes, and now we are talking about the network of scholars. Now, if you follow closely the previous discussions we've had, I told you that the first discussion was on on how to understand history through our local sources, and on the second talk we spoke about the Aqaid an-Nasafi, basically one text which was translated into the Malay language, as I said, as a sort of example to show the extent and the power and the descriptive powers of the Malay language in describing scientifically a conception of the world. Because the Aqaid an-Nasafi contains descriptions about knowledge, contains a description about the atomistic picture of the universe, and contains description about God, the afterlife, prophethood, the meanings of fidelity, the meanings of kufur, iman, and so on. This was in the 15th century. In the third and the last talk before this one, we deliberated on the ideas and the systems of Hamzah Fansuri and Nuruddin Ar-Raniri, two of the greatest scholars of the Malay world. And by then, the Malay language, which started as a lingua franca and spoken of by the coastal peoples of Sumatra, has now grown in terms of its descriptive abilities, its philosophic and analytical abilities to be able to describe multiple tiers of existence. For example, in the works of Ar-Raniri and Fansuri, the two of the doctrines that they started discussing were the discussion pertaining to the Wahdatul Wujud, the unity of existence, which is an advanced abstract ontological discussion. They also discuss doctrines pertaining to the soul, doctrines pertaining to nature, reality, and so on. So we stopped somehow in the last session when discussing Raniri and Fansuri in the 17th century. The coffee is only going to increase the intensity, so bear with me, please. Yes. All right. So, but by the time we get to the 17th century, and as Professor Al-Attas has argued in Historical Fact and Fiction, the timeline of the Islamization of the Malay archipelago, there were already records that there were local Muslim populations as early as the 7th century, 8th and 9th century. There were already tombstones here and there. And there were already records referring to people from China, that they were displaced, or the there was an Arab Muslim community in China who had to move to what is now Kedah, and they had a locality there. So in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, they were already Muslims in this part of the world. But the Islamization that happened during that period was relatively less intense. It was, as Professor Al-Attas was saying, at the stage of the Islamization of the body. It focused on just the basic aspects, because conversion is not a simple matter. Yes, conversion is unlike today, because right now when we talk about the matter of conversion, we don't really measure to what extent is the person who's now saying La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah becoming a Muslim. Because right now what matters most in some conversions, especially when it involves statecraft, is usually pertaining to marriage atau pertaining to other things that is involved with the state. So therefore it is of the utterance may be something just physical without necessarily measuring whether or not there were real changes in worldview. But real conversion to Islam involves changes in worldview. It's not a simple matter. Yes, it requires changes in your fundamental conception of being, existence. It makes claims about the existence of metaphysical entities. It makes claims about existence of angels, about the afterlife. It makes claims about knowledge also, that somehow your heart can affirm the existence of God. Faith is not something like a leap that you make that you are not certain of in the sense of knowledge. So when we talk about the conversion of the Malay people as reflected in the language, those who study semantic analysis or semantic field analysis of the language can see that the growth of the language now reflects a certain, shall we say, disturbance in the inward being of the Malays. Right now, there is a new conception, an alternate conception of reality that was happening from the 12th to the 16th to the 17th and the 19th centuries. This is why Professor Al-Attas was saying the first and longest period just now, the Islamization of the body, was followed by the Islamization of the mind and soul in the 12th century onwards. But by the time it got to the 17th and 19th centuries, it so intensified that Professor Al-Attas wanted to call this third period a different period. This is the period of tasawwuf. This is the period of intense Islamization activity through which the conception of the world right now, and as it becomes reflected in the language, is capable of describing the worldview of Islam as it is projected in the revelation, in the Quran. Remember that the Quran has already been translated in full with the based on the commentaries of the Jalalain, the Tafsir al-Jalalain in the 17th century by Abdul Rauf Sinkil or Abdul Rauf Fansuri. Yes, he translated the Quran by the name Tarjuman al-Mustafid. And this tafsir became the sole guide to the Malays, the Malay Muslims, for almost 300 years before another one another one is updated in terms of translating the Quran. So imagine, the Quran is not a simple text. Yes, have you read the Quran entirely in English? You should. Yes, it's God's means of communication with you. You know, what are we doing if we have not read it in full? So the Quran, I mean, look at the multiple versions of the Quran that exist in English, and none of them, yes, insofar as they are respectable, none of these, you know, be it Mamadou Pickthall, Abdullah Yusuf Ali, or any other translations that you've seen, can be done using just simple English, isn't it? People who have done these translations, in order for it to be respectable, are people who understood subtle nuances of the language, because they had to choose from every single existing word in Arabic that was utilized in the Quran that has colors and shades. They had to choose from some of these shades, and some of the words had to be put in parentheses, because this now would amount to a tafsir as opposed to a direct translation. There is no word-to-word translation of the Quran, because the Quran, the Arabic language in terms of its descriptive powers is such that so many meanings can be couched within a single term, such that in order for you to be fully to have a greater understanding of the Quran, you need to compare between several translations, and not only between several translations, but alongside the commentaries, because these translations, with very few exceptions, are in need of commentaries because certain verses are not only making historical references but also theological references, and they possess also references to other disciplines in Islam. So if Malay language was already capable of performing this arduous task of translating the Quran into Malay entirely in the 17th century, that also is a reflection of the extent of the scientific prowess of the language. But now, as the century progresses, yes, the big names of Malay scholarship. Right now, I wish to introduce the concept in our talk today of what is meant in the topic just now about Nusantara being an Amazon, like as in the line. You can also use any other site that does that. Maybe a Kindle or like basically it reflects a notion of a network through which you can obtain the benefits of the entire intellectual tradition. You see, the intellectual tradition of Islam, as we said just now in the beginning, it doesn't progress by parasite, but progresses through networks, because it progresses through the system of ijazah. Ijazah basically is a license to transmit and to teach the religion. This religion was studied initially from the Sahaba to the Prophet, isn't it? The Sahaba studied it with the Prophet, and the Prophet was the embodiment of knowledge. As Professor Al-Attas was saying, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not only communicating truth, but he constituted the truth. Because knowledge, as conceived in Islam, is not just a conceptual matter. It's not just a matter of understanding per se. Knowledge reflects or is reflected in your very being. That's why in the famous hadith Jibril, there is what we call Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. Yes, Islam is a matter of amal, meaning to say a matter of outward performance of what is held within. Yeah, so that's why there is salah, which with arkan, meaning to say with certain duties that you prescribe that is physically enacted. Zakat likewise, Saum of Ramadan likewise, and the Hajj likewise involves performance of your members. Even the Shahada, at least to a certain extent, in order for a person to be safe, to be considered Muslim within the community, it is sufficient for him to utter these utterances. However, Iman, on the other hand, reflects understanding. Yes, this is now basically your understanding of God, the books, a genuine understanding of prophets, a genuine understanding of the afterlife, and a genuine understanding of qada wal qadar, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's determination of your life, and his determination of certain other aspects of your life, such as your rizki and so on, and to understand the fine balance between free will and Allah's determinism. That's still in the realm of understanding. Although Iman now is much more than knowledge. Yes? Because now this understanding has to be performed via your Arkanul Islam. However, there is a third degree of this religion. And this third degree of religion is the Maqam of excellence, or the Maqam of Ihsan. And the Maqam of Ihsan is now something that you do while taking into consideration your consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is the performance of Sharia at that level, wherein all that you do, you are now conscious of Allah's presence. You are conscious when you pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He is all-seeing. Now basically it is now Iman in practice, like that. That is Ihsan. And Ihsan involves now not only just the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the ma'rifah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it involves also taking care of your inward aspects, yes, to remove the inward vices, to adorn yourself with the good characteristics, such as sabar, such as tawakkul, and so on and so forth. This is ihsan. So, in order for you to be a representative of this religion, and as the Prophet said, al-ulama warathatul anbiya, that scholars are the heirs to the prophets, are the inheritors of the prophets. Scholars now, basically from the Prophet to the Sahaba, and from the Sahaba to the Tabi'in, from the companions to those who follow the companions. And from then on, they are known as the ulama of this ummah. Now these very people, they have in order for authority and authenticity, they now rely on what we call the ijazah, the license of the teacher. So the teacher will be able to tell whether or not you are ready to transmit this, because now it is no longer whether or not you practice the religion, whether you understand the religion, but whether or not the religion has properly sat within you. It is now infused within you. You become now the ulama warathatul anbiya. So the matter of authenticity now relies on a certain sort of chain. Who were your teachers and what your teacher said of you? And why is this now important? Why is it that you cannot simply just return to the Quran and Sunnah and perform your own understanding and intellection? Well, it is okay, but it is not safe. You are now betting. Either you will hit the mark or you won't hit the mark. But those who engage themselves with teachers who are connected to this line of ijazah, what they possess now is something more profound. Because the validation of the teacher is validated by the teacher, in turn coming to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the Sahabas now, or the companions and those who follow them, began the work of excavation and the work of gathering together the knowledge derived from prophecy, the hadith and the Quran, and gradually out of this were born several scientific disciplines or Islamic sciences, tafsir, the sciences of hadith, and so on. At certain times in history, the scholars, they will gather around a jami'ah, a university, usually in the form of mosques, in circles of learning. And until today, some of these jami'ah survive, like the Jami'atul Azhar in Cairo, the Qurawiyin in North Africa, and certain other parts of the world. But there were times of political upheaval. There were times when the Muslims, for example, suffered under the hands of the colonizers. During these times, and this is the topic that we're discussing today, what was needed and what was required for the survival of this intellectual tradition were the networks of scholarships. Yes? And these network of scholars ensured the survival of the thing that they were carrying, the knowledge, through mobile universities. That means to say, in the sense of the professors moving about. Now let me demonstrate by taking a few examples. Sheikh Nuruddin Al-Raniri, as we said just now, he was born in Gujarat in India. Yes. However, he is born of Arab parentage or Arab descent. He went initially to Hadramaut to study in Yemen, and after that he went to the Haramain in Makkah. And after some time, he went to Pahang, yes, because of his family ties. His uncles was connected to the Pahang royal family, yes. And from then, the pupil under his tutelage, who would become Iskandar Thani of Aceh, became the son-in-law of the reigning king, Iskandar Muda of Aceh. So from his ascendancy to the throne, now Al-Raniri, who was the tutor to this man, became also the Sheikhul Islam of Aceh. But look at the mobility of Sheikh Nuruddin Al-Raniri being able to survive within different places. And each place that he went, because of his genius, the intellect that he possesses, and also because of the existing networks. Yes, because everywhere that these scholars go, they will leave behind students. And not only do they leave behind students, they leave behind writings. So the Malay world, in order for it to perform this task, had to have, first, local scholars. Second, institutions. Yes, in certain parts, these were done primarily in the house of, say, the royal courts. Sometimes they had pondok. Sometimes it was done in the masajid. Sometimes it was dependent on royal patronage, as we said. So there will be scholars who will remain here for the rest of their lives. And those who remain here, they will initiate a movement of translating works from the Arabic into the local language, thereby enriching the local language. So from there, other scholars who say, like Raniri, who come from Gujarat, they can study from existing works in the Malay language. And this now, the Malay language form part of, you see, the creative activity, the intelligence of our scholars. Only right now, I mean, those of you who are familiar with academic culture understand that universities, usually they form part of networks of universities. Yes, any of you in local universities, major ones, will find that your university is a member of some group of universities. They will have exchange programs with, say, maybe universities in Japan, in Europe, and so on. So right now, this practice is still prevalent, but amongst in the Malay world in the past, this was already present amongst our local scholars. Yes, but what was the convergence point? The convergence point was in the Haramain, the Makkah and the Madinah. Yes, because at that time, the Hajj season, will spend, say, maybe a few months. Some will remain for a few years to study. Yes, so you can follow the boat to Hajj. Now, when you get to Hajj, of course, before you go there, like the likes of Makassari, Sheikh Yusuf Makassar, he was a student of Ar-Raniri. When a major scholar like Raniri came to your shore, you study with him. Yes, after preparation by Ar-Raniri, say now Sheikh Yusuf Makassar is now ready to test his intellect in the Haramain. In the Haramain, he met major scholars of his time. And you will be astonished when you look at our local scholars in terms of their contact with the greatest scholars. I remember, do you know Murtada Zabidi? He wrote a voluminous work, a sharah of the Ihya Ulumuddin. A major scholar, basically. We find this. Without this knowledge of networks, we will think that this Murtada Zabidi is a major scholar. Maybe he must have been an Arab, teaching in Yemen and so on. But some of our local scholars studied directly under him. Yes? And he gave the ijazah to them. So how amazing is that? Yes? But this is not a romanticization of the past. I'm not talking about these things in order that we romanticize our past and go around the world and talk to people about these were our scholars in the past. I'm talking like this to you, first, to overcome inferiority complex on our part. Yes? That has been the persistent goal of this series, to overcome inferiority complex. Meaning to say that our scholars were second class, second grade, or that we possess nothing of the sort. So, or that we are like orphans. Yes? Somehow like we are macam indigenous people whose first introductions to the intellectual world came via the Europeans, like that. And most of us were like that. I was like that too. Yes. When I went to study in New Zealand, we went to look for who was the French and the German thinker. Yes. We prided ourselves when we know a Latin word, isn't it? And what do we know about our local scholars? They were maybe commentators or translators, like that. But when you look at the study of the networks of the scholars, it totally dispels that myth. I remember our teacher, Professor Zaini Uthman, who worked on Ar-Raniri's Lata'if, in his translation of Professor Al-Attas's Happiness, meaning an experience of happiness, in the preface, he writes, the first thing that he was indebted to Professor Al-Attas was to teach him how to look at our local scholars properly. Just to look at them properly will determine your ability to learn and benefit from them. And if this series of talks can do only that, it would have fulfilled its purpose. And for some of you, it already has. Yes, I know some of you have now started reading some of these works. Some of you are busy involving in transliterating some of these works, studying them alongside other scholars. Now let's get back to the network. We spoke about Ar-Raniri. Another very interesting case of somebody connected to this Amazon or to this great network, Sheikh Yusuf Makassari. Just now we said that he was studying Raniri and then he went to the Haramain. After the Haramain, and there he was already teaching the local Malays who studied there, including some Arabs who were studying there. He excelled in the sciences of Hadith and the sciences of Tasawwuf. He wrote works, penned works in Arabic. And after that, after having basically exhausted himself in the Haramain, which is a major achievement, after that he went on to Syria, to Damascus. And there, he so impressed his teacher that his teacher, Muhammad of the Khalwati sect, Tariqah, invested him the title of the Taj al-Khalwati, the crown of the Khalwatis. When Yusuf Makassar came back to Banten, which is now another Islamic principle in this part of the world, he married into the one of the princesses or of the reigning king. However, now this sultan was being, shall we say, there was an instigation from the Dutch against the sultan, and the Dutch was now trying to proffer up the son of the sultan or maybe a relative of the sultan to overcome him. And Yusuf Makassar sided with the sultan, and he then roused the people against the Dutch. So the Dutch, sensing the dangers of this Yusuf Makassar, first exiled him to Ceylon. Yes. Now, to show the live aspects of these networks, and because Yusuf Makassar already carried within him the equipments and the repertoire and all that he needed in terms of scholarship, when he went to Ceylon, he started penning more works. He made contact with the local Indian scholars, and through the Indian scholars there, he wrote books which he sent to Makkah, and from Makkah it came back to the Malay world, and he started orchestrating basically a movement against the Dutch from Ceylon. Yes. So that's why the Prophet, one of the hadith attributed to the Prophet is that the pen of scholars or the ink of scholars is more worthier than the blood of martyrs. See, because this guy is in Ceylon, yes? Imagine, it's like, truly it's like an invisible network through which he's connected. He can just translate a work and write. From there, it came to influence, and political upheavals can happen in this part of the world. People would think it's magic or it's sihr. No, it's not that. It's the existence of these networks. So what did the Dutch do? They decided to exile him even further, to the end of the world back then. It was at the Cape of Good Hope, yes, in South Africa. And what happened when he was sent to the Cape of Good Hope? Initially, he was sent to the Cape of Good Hope, yes, with a group of other scholars who came there, with people who didn't possess the networks, because now countries would be ranked according to their suitability of these networks based on, first, the existence of the Arabic language being spoken due to the existence of scholars. If it doesn't possess scholars or Arabic language or scholars who spoke the Arabic language, second in rank would be existence of Islamic languages. You can still do work there. You need to see one or two scholars spoke Arabic, you can connect yourself there, and you can send back to you can reroute basically your source. But the Dutch scholars sent him to the furthest end. That means to say to a country where there's no live networks. Yes, because in Ceylon he can still do damage. They sent him to Cape Town. Now in Cape Town, what can you do, isn't it? The local people there, the languages were distinct because they were the various tribes of the Africans. So what could he do? Well, because of his immense intellect, Yusuf Makassar in Ceylon and his dealings with the Dutch already learned some Dutch with him. Amazing man, isn't he? He learned some Dutch with him. He mixed it with some vocabulary coming from Malay. He wrote Dutch in Jawi script. Yes? And started converting people to Islam in Cape Town. Of course, by now his effects no longer transpired to the Malay world. He focused his Islamization activity in South Africa, and until today, there are still Muslims there. Yes? Amazing man. And while he was in Cape of Good Hope, he started influencing people. There, his final exile was to what is now Makassar of Cape Town. His mosque is still built there. And 300 years later, when Habib Omar bin Hafiz of Yemen started renewing this network of scholars and started visiting all places where these scholars have touched and put their traces, he now goes to Cape Town. He renewed Yusuf Makassar's activity, and therein basically he had students there, he has institutions there, and now Islam becomes alive again. But even before Habib Omar bin Hafiz, there were other networks of scholars who came. There were scholars in Cape Town. Yes, there were scholars coming from India. There were scholars coming from Turkey. There were scholars coming from the various parts of the world. As long as a network was established, the new, shall we say, satellite city can now receive shall we say, receive a channel or receive a signal through which the Islamization process can be reenacted like that. Amazing, isn't it? So after Yusuf Makassari passed, the network was then taken over by, he was co-students with Abdul Rauf Sinkir. We spoke about Abdul Rauf Sinkir. After that, there was like almost a missing century before the next group of scholars came. But this next group of scholars, I suppose, represented the culmination in the Malay intellectual tradition, because by now the network in this part of the world has grown and matured. Because now there were centers of learning. Remember, while these things were all happening, the pioneers of the Islamization mission of the Malay world, meaning to say the Hadrami Sayyids, they still kept on sending missions. And they set up Islamic kingdoms. Yes? So now, while Europe progressed scientifically and technologically, in the sense that now the Muslims can no longer compete with them in terms of technological abilities. So, yeah, it's good if you find out that we had a store of weapons and so on in Malacca, and that we had muskets and so on. But that's not the way forward, we yes, some aspects of technological imprints in terms of present-day technology was found in this part of the world. That's not the way forward. You have to, what is more important for you is to understand these invisible networks, that despite technological inferiority, this sort of guerrilla warfare was fought and won and maintained. How? The real question for you to ask now for yourselves is that how, despite 500 years of being under colonial rule, impinging on the economic, educational, political, philosophical, all aspects coming from the West came with all their might. How is it that despite all these movements, we are still Muslims? It's because of the existence of these invisible networks. It's not really invisible. It's invisible for those who do not have eyes. But for those who read the silsila, they will find very extremely interesting data. They will see, oh, Abdul Samad Palembang, or no, oh, Yusuf Makassari met with Imam Al-Haddad. Yes, Imam Al-Haddad of Yaman, of Hadramaut. There was a Hajj season when Imam Al-Haddad set out to Makkah and Medina to perform his Hajj. And during this season, Imam Al-Haddad has already gained in prominence such that everyone there cannot miss him. And one of those who sought barakah and ijazah from Imam Al-Haddad was none other than this Yusuf Makassari. To the extent that Imam Al-Haddad mentioned him in one of his fatwa, he said, this Yusuf of the Javanese islands, it's just one fatwa. But for us, oh, yes, isn't it? Because now that shows there's a connection between the Hadrami world and the Malay world. He said, one of our students, this Yusuf of Java, he held in one of his fatwas pertaining to the mu'amalah, meaning to say day-to-day transactions in terms of ethics, politics, and economics, this position. Of course, the generality of scholars in Hadramaut hold to this position. But just that, when you see Yusuf of Java, I know this man. Yes, he's our teacher. Yes. Or when Abdul Samad Palembang is mentioned in the biographical dictionaries, this is another important feature of the invisible network. Biographical dictionaries is how you track, yes, individual, say, network players. Yes, biographical dictionaries, otherwise known in Arabic as the tabaqat. It's a genre of its own. Another thing I suppose to add to this description is that the biographical dictionaries as a genre of its own was meant to preserve knowledge. And in particular, the biographies, the biographers or the biographical dictionaries which were most important and most voluminous and most developed as a science were for the sciences of hadith, the sciences of fiqh, and also the tariqah in Sufi, yes, the Sufis. So these three are well documented. So you will find, for example, the directory of Sufi scholars, the directory of Shafi'i scholars, the directory of hadith scholars. Initially, those who gain prominence in one field sometimes also gain prominence in other fields. But at a certain time, and this was nearing Imam Al-Ghazali's time, 5th century after Hijrah, right now the disciplines appear because of their growth to be splitting from each other. There were people who were fuqaha who were not also Sufis. There were people who were Sufis who were ignorant of the science of hadith, or claim to be Sufis but ignorant of the science of hadith. There were people of this and this and this, basically of specializations that threatens the integrity of this network. So Imam Al-Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin is meant to write, to combine these things again within one personality. In the Prophet, it's one. In the Sahaba, it's one. In the Tabi'in, it's one. But gradually, when the sciences develop, individual predispositions and predilections are different. Some people are good in hadith. Some people are better good in hadith collection. Others, they tend towards, say, for example, theoretical speculation in the science of kalam. Others are better at introspection, so they become the arbab of tasawwuf. Others have linguistic taste, like that. Ever so rarely, you will find one scholar who's a master of all. And when that scholar is a master of all, this is how the network progressed, or basically this is how the network was preserved. When one scholar emerges who's a master of all these disciplines, or a number of these disciplines, he becomes, for that time, the golden chain through which other people become connected. So that's how we can have now, in terms of the silsilah networks of scholars, you can find until today, there are certain scholars that if you take benefit from, they were part of that line and chain of scholars through which certain names are familiar, despite that, or in spite of, we can see, say, there are now, by now, perhaps thousands, if not millions of chains, isn't it, to the Prophet, if you multiply according to the law of networks. However, there will be certain names that will appear in all the silsilah. These are the likes of Imam Al-Ghazali, the Hujjatul Islam, the proof of Islam. This is one of the means through which he is, in fact, deserving of that name. Junaid Al-Baghdadi, Imam An-Nawawi, Sheikh Abdul Qadir Al-Jailani, and in the Ba'alawi line, Imam Al-Haddad, Sheikh Faqih Muqaddam. A few of these names, they will prefigure in all. That's the extent of their strength. Yes, basically they have accomplishments in hadith, they have accomplishments in tafsir, they have accomplishments in law. One such another person is, as we mentioned just now, Jalaluddin As-Suyuti. I think he was called the Ibnul Kutub, the son of books. He was born in a library, you know. His mother was a scholar, his father was a scholar. When the mother was of advanced, was close to the due date, the father asked her if she could borrow a book for him at the maktabah. So prescribed when she was in the process of checking out the book, she felt that she needed to deliver this Jalaluddin Suyuti. So he was then born, you know, as the son of books. And truly did he become a son of books in his time. He really, first in fiqh, he achieved the, in terms of, he unlocked the station of the Mujtahid Mutlaq. He unlocked various stations. He was a hafiz of hadith, meaning to say memorize 100,000 hadith or more. Like these accomplishments. It's a truly great intellectual tradition that we belong to. That's why for Professor Al-Attas, and for now I get a tiny sense of his frustration. Yes? The sign that you have knowledge is your frustration and anger. Why? Because now for close to a century, the two major means through which we have been robbed of this rich inheritance is, first, we have been divorced from it, and second, we have been inculcated with an alternative value system and educational process through which these things are, for most of us, we hear it for the first time, or we have to discover it with painstaking efforts. And furthermore, we now no longer possess the methodological tools, such that, we know our Malay is not good enough to study it. We don't know, we cannot read Old Jawi. We don't know Arabic. If we know Arabic, it is for conversation. And even greater obstacle to that is that we first have to suffer a life crisis before we want to go to these things, isn't it? Right now, the means to get to it is depression, anxiety, and so on. Or, okay, I want religion. Gitu. And otherwise, if we are on the track of becoming successful in our lives, who cares about these things? Anyways, So we got on to Yusuf Makassar, Jalaluddin Sayuti. By the time it got to Abdul Samad Palembang, we said he was part of the best, of the cream de la creme, because there were 5 people representing the major parts or the major intellectual centers of learning in his time. There was him, who represented the island of Sumatra, Abdul Samad of Palembang. There was Daud Al-Fatani from Patani, Thailand. There was Arshad Al-Banjari, the author of the Sabil Al-Muhtadin, an excellent work of fiqh that basically takes into consideration the most advanced qawl in the fiqh of a Shafi'i, who was also a Sufi. He represented Al-Banjari, meaning Kalimantan. There was also Al-Bugisi, from Sulawesi. So and there were a few others in their batch. Imagine, one person representing a continent like that, or representing an entire island, and when they come back, the entire island, not tiny islands, big islands, yes? Thousands, if not millions of people benefited from these people. Until today, the sanad of the Malay people will end up in these people, and from them, you get rerouted to the major traditions. Of course, until today, not all of them want to go through the door of the Malay scholars. Until today and back then, there were still people who preferred to go through the Arab scholars, be it of Tunisia, Hadramaut, and so on. And these 5 scholars, why they are so essential in the network of scholars, was because they studied with 2 major scholars, Al-Kushashi and Ibrahim Al-Qurani. And these 2 also was of the likes of the people I mentioned, those who gathered together within themselves. So these networks, sorry guys. These networks were important in themselves because, as we said just now, 2 of the most important disciplines, I said 3, but 2 of the most important ones with these biographical dictionaries were hadith and the science of tariqah. These 2 rely on chains of transmission. But in these people, they were both. They were both muhaddith, they had chains of hadith, and they also had chains of tariqah. And in some of them, multiple turuq. So when Yusuf Makassar was sent to Cape of Good Hope, he could initiate somebody in the Shatariyah order, in the Rifa'i order, in the Naqshbandi order. Some of them 5 orders, 6 orders, 7 orders within themselves. Meaning to say they were, and because the silsilah of hadith and the silsilah of tasawwuf existed within themselves, their interests also, meaning to say their intentions for the religion determines the entire generation. So those who studied with these people will have some of their mannerisms and their intentions. And their intentions was the rapprochement between tasawwuf and the sharia. Whereas in the earlier period, Hamzah Fansuri, Nuruddin Rani, not Rani, Hamzah Fansuri, Shamsuddin Sumatrani, these people were more properly Sufis of the school of Ibn Arabi. So as a result, some of their doctrines were not perhaps as they were not as meticulous in their hadith research, and so they were under attack from various grounds. But the later people, they were hadith scholars who were Sufis. So it reflects a certain sense of balance. That's why the Malay people as a whole until today is a balanced people. We're not extremes. We're not extremists. But if you take one without the other, it will lead to extremism. This is the dictum of Imam Malik. Whoever takes tasawwuf without the ilm of Sharia, he becomes a zindiq, meaning to say a deviant. And whoever takes the Sharia without tasawwuf, he becomes a fasik. He becomes also a sort of extremist like that. So the Malay world, until today, that's why we have to say, that's why the Malay world is described by balance, and when the central basis of that culture, that civilization are scholars of balance, the rest of the people will reflect it and refract it through cultural medium and cultural means and pantuns. All our pantuns and all the cultural productions of this time were sourced based on these powerful personalities. Yes, you look at the wayang kulit. Don't be a people who is mesmerized by the wayang kulit until you forget the purpose of the wayang kulit. The wayang kulit was initiated by Sunan Kalijaga of the Javanese island, who was a student of the other saints who were scholars. In particular, Ibrahim Sunan Bonang. Yeah, Ibrahim Sunan Bonang was an accomplished scholar who referred to the likes of Abu Talib Maki, Al-Ghazali, and Nawawi, and so on. All he did was, in order to be able to attract the people to this pure water of knowledge, he introduced a medium through which they become attracted. But people today, now, one of the things that we've begun to notice, because they say, oh, Islam was spread through the wayang kulit in this part, so therefore they value and worship this wayang kulit, forgetting that it is just a symbol. This is our problem today. So there is this worship of all these things without understanding what they were pointing towards. Thus, what happens is what Professor Al-Attas recorded sociologically in his Sufism as understood and practiced amongst the Malays, which he did basically a field survey in the 60s, wherein some of these things, although initially they had, shall we say, the Sufis were the ones who introduced these things, yes, the Hadrah, the Zikir Barat, they introduced the Ratib ceremony, and they introduced all these ceremonies. But when the projector of this message, meaning scholars, will go, if you take them out of the equation and you leave behind these shells, they begin to become a medium for the projection of the nafs. That's why DK Barat, you can ask, apa kena mengena DK Barat dengan zikrullah, isn't it? Because dah tak ada, the connection is now severed. The wayang kulit likewise can now become a projector for the stories which are not only banal, but sometimes against the very teachings of this religion. These are medium. Do not confuse symbols for what they represent. Like that. So our culture and our civilization can only become Islamic to the extent that they serve accurately the interests of the worldview of Islam. And Islamization as a process ought and needs to be reenacted by every generation. And this is what we are doing tonight when we discuss these things. We are the ones, it is up to us, it is our responsibilities to reenact this process of Islamization, to understand what they are for, what the symbols are for, and what they represent. Otherwise, we will be held responsible because this amanah is now upon us. Yes, I think with that note, I should end because I've exceeded my time. Yes, okay, thank you.